Hi everyone, welcome to our first coffee chat of 2021. My name is Daniel Chuckenbrough and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager at Brookes Publishing, and I'm very happy to have Glen Dunlap and Janice here today to talk about the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce model for young children and how to develop and implement intensive individualized interventions. So before we begin, I just have a few webinar tips to go over. There we go. Okay, so first and foremost, if you have any applications open on your computer, such as email or other web browsers, if you close those applications, that can improve your bandwidth for watching the webinar today. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can go ahead and submit those in the questions tab, and we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end where we'll take those questions. And if you'd like to minimize the webinar panel, there's a little orange arrow at the top that you can minimize the panel to increase the presentation window. And if you're experiencing any audio issues during this webinar, you can check the audio tab to make sure that you have the correct audio source selected and make sure that your speakers are turned up. And if that's not working, you can exit out of the webinar and join back in, and that'll usually alleviate any issues that you may have. So Glen and Janice are co-authors of the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, the early childhood model for individualized positive behavior support. This is a practical, reader-friendly guide that explores how to improve social emotional development and prevent challenging behaviors of young children in preschool settings. Glen and Janice are also working on a new edition of Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, and we hope to have that coming to publication soon. And if you'd like to learn more about Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children, you can go to bpub.fyi/PTR-YC. And we will also be doing a book giveaway. So we'll be giving away one copy of Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children. So one attendee will be selected at random and emailed after the webinar. So you can go ahead and submit your questions to increase your chances of winning. And then after the webinar, you'll also be prompted to complete a short survey. So we'd love to know what our audience thinks of these webinars. So just let us know your thoughts, and you'll also be entered to win a free copy of PTR-YC. And last but not least, certificates of attendance are available for all webinar viewers and recording viewers. And I'll provide a little bit more information about how to access those certificates at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Glen Dunlap lives in Reno, Nevada, and is affiliated with the University of Nevada, Reno, where he focuses on positive behavior support, early intervention, developmental disabilities, and family support. Glen has worked in this field for more than 40 years and has served as a teacher, administrator, researcher, university faculty member. And Glen was the founder of the Association for Positive Behavior Support and the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions. And he was the editor for 10 years of the journal Topics in Early Childhood Special Education. And Janice Lee is a faculty member with the Nevada Center for Excellence in Disabilities at the University of Nevada, Reno, and is a state coordinator for the Nevada Pyramid Model Partnership. Janice has over 20 years of experience as a teacher, trainer, coach, technical assistance provider, and consultant at the local, state, national, and international levels. So without further ado, Janice and Glen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I hope everybody is doing well and staying safe. And thank you very much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you with us. Today's session is going to very briefly describe the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children model. It's a model of positive behavior support designed for use as a tertiary intervention for the most serious challenging behaviors encountered in classrooms and childcare settings. I'm going to start with an introduction to PTR-YC, including a description of the importance of challenging behavior and understanding challenging behavior. Then Janice will take over, and she's going to describe how the model works, including options for assessment and intervention strategies. And following that, then we'll have time for some questions, and we look forward to those. So, as I just said, PTR-YC is a model of individualized positive behavior support designed for implementation in group settings, such as pre-K classrooms, public and private childcare, Head Start, all of which serve young children. It is a standardized model designed to enhance fidelity of implementation. And by standardized, what I mean is it's a manualized process. That is, the book contains a detailed information about every step that is needed to complete the process. So who and what is PTR-YC for? Number one, it is for young children with the most severe or most challenging behaviors. Now, by challenging behaviors, I'm referring to the severe kind, which are really a problem: hitting, screaming, tantrums, meltdowns, and so on. I'm also referring to persistent challenging behaviors. These are challenging behaviors that aren't episodic, but they're sort of ongoing. You can expect it to happen, if not every day, then pretty close to every day. These are also behaviors that have proven resistant to evidence-based universal and secondary procedures. That is, high quality guidance and regular classroom practice. If those are being implemented well, and the behaviors are still going on day after day, week after week, months, then this is what PTR-YC is for. Finally, it's also to be used by classroom teams. Teams being made up of early childhood professionals, teachers, other classroom personnel, etc., who are committed to helping children learn adaptive and appropriate social emotional behaviors. This is really quite important. The commitment is essential, because PTR-YC, in tune with how serious the challenging behaviors are, requires time, and it requires a group effort. So there has to be a real commitment to see it through and to make it work. All right. PTR-YC is intended for those behaviors and interventions that are at what we call the top of the pyramid. That is, they're not like regular or even kind of targeted behaviors. These are for really the most troublesome behaviors. Not all classrooms will need PTR-YC, but some will, and we'll get to that in more detail. As Daniel mentioned, this is the book. It was first published in 2013, and it is a detailed manual with almost scripted steps designed to enhance the fidelity with which the process is implemented. In addition to Janice and me, the authors include Kelly Wilson and Phil Strain, both of whom are in Colorado. PTR-YC is part of the Pyramid Model family of products that Paul Brookes publishes. If you're unfamiliar with the Pyramid Model, or would like more information about it, you can go to the website at challengingbehavior.org. That's challengingbehavior.org. Or if you just Google challenging behavior, that's what will come up as the first option listed by the search engine. Challengingbehavior.org, the website is sponsored by the National Center on Pyramid Model Innovations. And that website contains loads of information about the pyramid model and contains a very large amount of quite helpful resources. I also want to mention the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce is part of a suite of PTR manuals. The first Prevent, Teach, Reinforce manual was developed for schools for behaviors of students between kindergarten and 12th grade. What you see here on the screen is the cover of the second edition, which was published just a few years ago. But in addition, there is a model for families and communities called Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Families. This was published just also a few years ago, but is now being subjected to empirical evaluation, and it's proving to be helpful for many families. Parents or primary caregivers are the folks who are the intervention agents with this model, but they are doing it with assistance from a facilitator. All right. So before going further, I want to talk a little bit about individualized positive behavior support. And the reason for that is that PTR-YC is a model of positive behavior support. And what's that? All right, here we go. There are some principles. We sometimes call them assumptions, but they're really more than assumptions. They are lawful principles that are the foundation of individualized positive behavior support. First, challenging behaviors, and as it so happens, desirable behaviors as well, are maintained by their consequences. This is simple. Everybody knows this. Reinforcers, positive reinforcement works. But it's important to appreciate deeply that if challenging behavior occurs persistently, somehow it is being reinforced. Not intentionally, sometimes not obviously, but it is being reinforced somehow. Second, challenging behaviors occur in context. They don't occur randomly. They occur under some circumstances and not under other circumstances. Understanding how the context, how the antecedent environment influences the occurrence of challenging behaviors is real key to developing effective intervention strategies. And finally, challenging behaviors are communicative. Now, by communicative, I don't mean that they're deliberate or that they are intentional, but they are communicative. They act on the social environment in ways similar to conventional speech or nonverbal communication. So that is another key principle of individualized positive behavior support. The purpose of the communication is what we call function. All right, so what are functions? Well, as I said, challenging behaviors are communicative. One whole set of functions can be interpreted as a request to get something. A tantrum may be emitted in order to get attention. Hitting somebody may be imposed in order to get a toy or to grab a snack or an activity. So a whole set of functions can be categorized as to get something. And then a whole set of functions can be categorized as avoiding something. I don't want to leave the sand table, so I'm going to scream my head off or scratch you and bite you, and you'll leave and leave me alone. Often challenging behaviors communicate that the child is in discomfort of some kind. Obviously, it's very important to figure out what these functions are so that we can figure out how to resolve them. Objectives of individualized positive behavior support are fairly simple. One, to teach improved communication skills for the child to use instead of challenging behaviors, number one. Two, to prevent challenging behaviors by managing the antecedent context. And three, to reinforce desirable behavior and to do our best to avoid reinforcement for challenging behavior. The key is to figure out what to teach and what to change in the context, and this is accomplished with functional behavioral assessment. So individualized positive behavior support, you may occasionally hear it referred to as assessment-based positive behavior support or function-based positive behavior support. That's all fine. We can nod our heads and agree with those terms. But the important thing here for this purpose is that PTR-YC is a model of individualized positive behavior support. There are a few features I want to briefly mention. One, PTR-YC is based on research-based practices. All of the assessment and intervention strategies in the manual and in the model are supported by empirical and experimental applied research. Second, The decisions about exactly what interventions to use or how to go about using them, the decisions are made by the team, by the people actually working in the classroom or the child care setting and working with that child. And this is really, really important, because if you're the one making the decision, you're going to be more invested in making sure that that intervention is used correctly. Third, PTR-YC is manualized with detailed steps for designing and implementing intervention plans. This is for the purpose of increasing fidelity. And then finally, all of the behavior intervention plans include at least 3 components: at least one strategy from the prevent category, at least one from teach, and at least one from reinforce. The main reason for this is that it makes the intervention more robust. That is, if we slip up on one of the strategies, other strategies can sort of pick up the slack and make sure that overall the intervention will be effective. Also, the prevent component is often best for achieving immediate or short-term changes that are, whereas teach, the teach and reinforce strategies are more crucial for long-term skill building and desirable behavior change. So that's my introduction. And now I'm going to turn it over to Janice, and she will describe what the model looks like and how it's implemented. In other words, she's going to give you the good stuff. Thank you. Janice, are you there?
Yes, great. Thanks, Glenn. Hopefully everybody can hear. I've been having some internet connections, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to stay connected. So really briefly, just a
Janice, do you want to come in here and sit in this chair?
We could also try, if you turn off your webcam, that may help. We're just having a few audio issues. Okay.
Just a minute, I'm going to get Jan.
Review of the process. There are 5 steps. You know, the first step, again, it aligns a lot with the individual.
Why don't you come down here and use my chair, and you can use the controller. You can use this,
Great.
And then you can use that mouse to click.
Okay, technical difficulties. Sorry for that. Thank you for being flexible. Good thing we had a backup plan of being in the same location. So let me just briefly cover the process of PTR-YC. So we do, it's a 5-step process, which is based on the Individualized Positive Behavior Support Plan process. That really aligns with what Glenn already covered. But these are the 5 steps, and I'm just going to briefly cover those. Because of the length of time for the coffee chat, we don't have a lot of time to get into them individually, but I'll show you just a brief overview and also be able to show you a visual of what some of the forms look like, just so that there is some familiarity. So the first step is always about teaming and goal setting. So teaming is really, again, identifying who those relevant people are, who know the child, who know the context. So we always like to encourage that those relevant team members are present and participate in these meetings. We like to, as much as possible, include families and other primary caregivers, but depending on the context in terms of what type of program you have, parental involvement, I guess, in this process is not necessarily required. And we always say that with a caveat, again, depending on the type of program that you have, you may need permissions for assessment, for example, or just permissions for observations for those outside of the classroom, etc. So family involvement can look very different, and part of what's included in the manual is a chapter about families and around family involvement and how that may differ based on the program and setting that you're in. But really that teaming part is getting those individuals together, talking about the purpose of why an individualized support plan may be necessary and may be required. So again, just as Glenn talked about, getting everybody on the same page and really having that commitment moving forward with a focus on really supporting that child and that family. So we always recommend, and one of this first step is you have an initial meeting, a team meeting, to discuss and identify goals. Again, we want to be very specific and targeted with this process. And so, in a lot of our experiences, when you have these first meetings, a lot of times people want to jump in and talk about what they've done or possible strategies they can implement. But again, the purpose of PTR-YC is to help manualize things so that people follow the steps and implement with fidelity. So again, that is the purpose and why we, essentially scripted these things out, as Glenn mentioned. So we always recommend that teams identify one primary challenging behavior to begin with in terms of what team is interested in reducing or eliminating in that sense. Usually most teams, want the behavior to go away, but we are really talking about reductions, especially at least at the outset. And then what we also want teams to focus on is, that skill building component, or what's an appropriate behavior or an acceptable behavior that would be helpful for that child to demonstrate and be able to do with some consistency in those particular settings, in those contexts. And so generally we're talking about those social and emotional skills. And so this is where, we really want to focus on that in terms of a skill building teaching process. And then the second step is around practical data collection, and we use this for progress monitoring. And basically the team, part of their meetings and them working together is to identify which data they want to collect. So again, in the manual, there's a lot more detail in this arena, but we provide and utilize a behavior rating scale, which many people are familiar with, at least at this time, in terms of being able to fill out. It's basically just a Likert scale, and I'll show you a quick visual of what that would look like. But the team is going to identify all the components about data collection. So what kind of information or data are you collecting? When is that going to happen, right? Perhaps it might just be one activity or routine throughout the day. For some children, we may be talking about tracking and collecting data and information for the whole day. How that's going to happen and who's the primary person who's going to do that. So we have worked with teams over the years that it's, the lead teacher may take on that role. In other classrooms, people may rotate, and share those responsibilities. So again, every team, this is where you can customize it. Every team can decide what's the best method for them and what's going to work best based on how their classroom works. And basically data collection is really about collecting the information that you need in order to make decisions. So we want it to be efficient. We also want it to be valid and that it's reliable and meaningful. So here's an example, or not an example, here is the form, the behavior rating scale. And again, normally if we have a longer time, we would go into a little bit more detail. But essentially, we are asking classroom teams to collect one piece of information, and basically for that challenging behavior, to give it a ratings on a Likert type of scale, on a scale of 1 to 5 for that day or that period. So we're not asking people to collect data every incident of a behavior, but it's one time a day that they would rate challenging behavior on a scale of 1 to 5, and then also for that day or for that time period of that day, rate the desirable or appropriate behavior on a scale of 1 to 5. So we're asking people, classroom teams to really collect and rate 2 things in a day. All right, and so again, normally we'd spend a little bit more time describing how this works, but I think a lot of people are familiar with using rating scales of this type. And so this one is designed where you could collect, for a 5-day-a-week program, a month's worth of data on this sheet. All right, so the third step in the individualized behavior support plan process and for PTR-YC is to conduct and complete a functional behavioral assessment. So for the PTR-YC model, we use a checklist format. It's very similar with what's in the PTR and PTR for Families model as well. But there's 3-part components, and I'll show you just a quick screenshot of each of those forms. And essentially, it's a series of questions in a checklist format with check boxes. The first form is to identify what the antecedents and what are some of the environmental influences or what's happening in the environment that may be contributing to the persistence of this challenging behavior. The second component for a functional behavior assessment is to determine the function of the challenging behavior itself. So that communicative part that Glenn talked about earlier, that's what we want to really be able to hopefully with this process pinpoint, and we utilize the checklist format to utilize people's knowledge that they have, so those that know this child the best. And then the third part of the functional behavioral assessment is to identify what effective reinforcers there are for this particular child, what's reinforcing the challenging behavior, and then also if we want to reinforce desirable and appropriate behavior, what might those reinforcers be for this particular child, and really to individualize that as much as possible. So with the forms, they can be filled out individually by individual team members, and teams can come together to discuss their answers and come to a consensus in terms of some agreement in how they're answering those particular questions. Or they can be completed together as a team where everybody sits around and discusses each question and then identifies what those relevant elements might be. But ultimately, the goal is to gather as much information about the challenging behavior as possible, as well as desirable, behavior that we want to see. And the culmination of a functional behavior assessment comes down to developing a hypothesis statement, which really is about the team having a succinct understanding of when the challenging behavior is likely to occur, the function or the purpose that it serves, so that that can then drive the intervention strategies that may be identified. So here's just an example of the few of the questions from the prevent checklist. And again, this checklist helps to identify those antecedent or environmental interventions. Again, these are just 4 of the questions out of 9. And so there's a question, and then that's checkbox type of answers and responses that people can provide. This is a screenshot of a few of the questions from the teach checklist. Again, this is all part of that functional behavior assessment component. And again, with this checklist, we want to be trying to identify what the function or the purpose of the challenging behavior is. That's the primary purpose for this form. And then this is a screenshot of a few of the questions from the reinforced checklist. So primarily, what is the current consequence that is happening for that particular child's challenging behavior, and what are also some potential reinforcers or things that may be motivating for this particular child, especially around desirable behavior. So after the functional behavior assessment checklists are completed and the team has met to discuss those and has come to a consensus on a hypothesis statement, then the next step is about designing and implementing the actual intervention plan. So part of what's included in this manual is a menu of intervention options, and I'll show you just really briefly what the menu looks like. But in the manual, there are complete descriptions of each of the strategies, as well as examples and considerations to include. So we've also included considerations for kids who might have delays or disabilities. So it really does help provide a more in-depth description of each of the intervention strategies that are potential options. And also to help teams think about connecting that hypothesis statement to the intervention strategy. That is a really big key process. So as the model suggests and indicates, and as Glen already previewed, that we do have 3 categories, again, to make that plan more robust, so that if one strategy falters or maybe isn't followed with fidelity, that hopefully those other strategies will be enough to encourage and maintain the desirable behavior that we want to see. So we see we want teams to implement at least one prevent strategy, at least one teach strategy, and then in the upcoming 2nd edition, really thinking about how we reinforce appropriate behavior and stop reinforcing the challenging behavior as much as we possibly can. All right, and so part of the intervention plan is not only to identify which strategies a team is agreeing to implement and has consensus about what that plan will look like, but also that plan should really lay out the details in terms of how the implementation of those strategies will occur. So that's what the detail of the intervention plan will include, possibly the steps for implementing and really the details about when teams are going to be implementing those strategies as well. So we do recommend that step-by-step instructions are clearly and explicitly laid out. So again, who is going to do it, when it's going to happen, if there's a particular location where it will occur or during which activity, and if you need particular materials, what are those, and making sure that those are readily available. And so sometimes materials may need to be created, for example. So the whole intervention planning process should include all of those details. And then we want to make sure that from a team perspective, that if training is needed or coaching is needed, that is planned for and discussed and implemented so that teachers and other support staff in the classroom have the tools and the support that they need. And also we recommend that teams from the beginning talk about when and how often they're going to review and discuss progress. Also to think about the decision-making component. If things are going well, kind of what's the decision-making process for that? And if things are not going well, what steps might you follow? And so again, the manual goes into a lot more detail around that as well, if teams are unfamiliar with utilizing this process. So again, here's just a quick intervention, what the intervention menu looks like with the 3 categories of strategies. And I'm just put the prevent strategies on this slide because we did want to focus a lot more on the prevention component because it does align with a lot of what's happening around quality rating systems in many states that are occurring. And so we cannot overemphasize these prevention type of strategies enough. But again, this is a tertiary model. So even in some of the best classrooms, we may have a child who needs more individualized strategies. So this is a way that we can really focus on individualizing even more so for a child who may need more individualized support. So again, in the manual, each of these strategies, so for all of the for the prevent, teach, and reinforce categories, there is an appendix that includes explicit detail about each of these strategies here. We provide definitions and rationale for when you might use it. Again, those considerations for when it might be appropriate to utilize this a particular strategy. And we have detailed examples of how that could be implemented across a variety of examples of activities throughout the day. So providing choices, one of the first items on the menu, is a common one that is implemented in many plans. I think that a lot of us have written and have supported teams with, is providing children with choices in terms of difficult or perhaps undesirable activities that they want to engage in during the day. Using visual supports and schedules is another prevention strategy that is utilized very often. And so for some kids, something that's a little bit more concrete for them, maybe something that is tangible that they can hold and perhaps manipulate, sometimes for some kids is of more interest and gets them more engaged in those classroom types of activities. And having predictable and really consistent schedules and routines throughout the day is also very, very helpful. So with that, Brookes put together this really nice infographic. So I'm just sharing that with you here today on the screen, but it is included in the handouts as well. Part of what's in the PTR-YC manual is an overview of these 5 classroom-wide practices around improve behavior. And really, if we think about the classroom management practices that we know work for young children, especially for preschoolers, this is really a lot of what it's all about. And again, aligns with not just pyramid model, but a lot of what's in many states around their quality rating systems. So again, because we don't have as much time today to go in them in detail, hopefully as in conjunction with using the PTR-YC model, this can definitely be an infographic that's easily shareable amongst teams that you're working with and with your classrooms. And so this really encompasses a lot of the prevention strategies as well. So even if classrooms are engaging in these practices, perhaps those prevention strategies may focus on individualizing, again, a little bit more for a particular child. All right, and then just really briefly, the teach strategies. Again, when we want long-term change and commitment from the teams, it's not just about reducing challenging behavior, but thinking about what is an appropriate skill, and generally an appropriate social and emotional skill for this particular child to either learn to begin with, or to either enhance their ability to engage in that skill and with consistency and predictability. So these are some of the items, and generally that communication skill is often one that is used in many of our teams, and that's generally tends to be one of the top strategies that are identified by teams, but also that the item around peer-related social skills tends to be a pretty common one as well. Many of the children that we are talking about that need individualized support often need help with communication skills. Even if they have good verbal language, perhaps their ability to communicate their feelings and emotions may not be as refined as we would expect, or that would be appropriate for that particular setting. So again, in the manual, there's a lot more detail around that, but the communication piece is generally a big component for many of our children that we're talking about, and for the teams that we're doing. And then just really briefly, the reinforced strategy, we do recommend this 3-step process of making sure we're not reinforcing challenging behavior, that we do have effective reinforcers for this child, so that we can reinforce their desirable behavior. So again, just really a quick overview of that process. And so as we're implementing, and if there's any coaching and training that's needed in the classroom, then as implementation is happening, part of the next step, or the final step, is thinking about using our data for database decision making, and also identifying any possible next steps. So we do recommend the data collection process, again, that behavior rating scale form for progress monitoring. And so, again, we're not taking it each incident, but thinking about across the day, what does that look like? So general recommendations is we use our data, and hopefully teams are looking at that hopefully daily, and thinking about tracking the progress. And, again, our recommendation, if you're making progress and things are improving, then you want to continue with that. And we can't emphasize that enough, because oftentimes when teams start to see improvement, sometimes the supports that they're providing, they feel like maybe that child doesn't need them anymore. And so perhaps, they will automatically fade their support, and we may see challenging behavior start to reemerge. So again, we want to make sure to get some consistency around that. And that's what that database decision making is really, really important for teams to really decide how long should we see progress before we want to move on to next steps. So that's an important decision for teams to talk about, right? Is it 5 days? Is it 10 days? Is it a month? Unfortunately, if we had a strong formula, we would share that with you. But again, this is an individualized process, so it will really depend on that. But sometimes, in most of our situations, the progress is generally pretty good at the beginning, but there are situations where maybe we're not seeing the progress that we would expect. So one thing is to look at the data and think about, are they accurate? Are they consistent with your impressions, or how you're feeling about it, or how the teacher or the teaching team is feeling about it? That's an important gauge, So if the teacher's feeling that it's really intense every day, but their ratings are like a 2 or a 3 on the behavior rating scale, again, you may think about, is that really matching how the teaching team is really feeling about that? And if not, you should make some adjustments. Also, there's some components of PTR-YC in terms of checking for fidelity, making sure that people are following the plan and following each part of the plan as well. And so that's the big fidelity measure. And again, PTR-YC was designed to help make that little bit more systematic. Perhaps, you know, the reinforcers maybe have lost their strength or their power. So we might think about reevaluating that for the children that we're talking about. And then sometimes maybe the functional assessment process, again, utilizing those checklists, perhaps we didn't incorporate all the detail perhaps that we may need to have an effective plan. So teams may want to go back and look at those components as well. So hopefully there's progress. We're seeing that happen, and classroom teams are able to be more effective and efficient. So we encourage that teams continue to meet periodically until they really do identify, you know, are comfortable with the improvement in the challenging behavior. For some of our children, we may continue with that behavior intervention plan and perhaps add new skills. That is definitely something that some of our teams have participated in and done in terms of, you know, moving forward and thinking about other new skills that they may want to teach. Also, we want to share and celebrate with families, again, depending on, you know, or I should say, regardless of how much they've been involved or participated, we should still be sharing our progress or the progress that's happening in the classroom with families and other caregivers, and then also with our colleagues as well, within the classroom, outside of the classroom, and within the program. And the big thing is we want to celebrate success and share that widely as much as possible. All right, so just a quick summary. Again, for PTR-YC, it's important to understand challenging behavior. And again, today was just a really brief overview of that. And that PTR-YC is a 5-step process and is a model of individualized positive behavior support. We will overemphasize utilizing and implementing and making sure that we support classrooms in those 5 classroom-wide practices, and as much as possible, really focusing a lot on those prevention strategies. And again, not as a way to avoid challenging behavior, but as a way to support children to be as engaged as possible in that particular environment. And just another reminder that the 2nd edition is coming soon, and so we look forward to that. So, questions? Logistically, I'm not sure how we want to do this.
I think it goes to Daniel.
Yes, it does go to Daniel.
Great. Well, thank you, Glenn and Janice, so much for that excellent information. We have gotten tons of really good questions. So I guess to start, I'll let you guys get situated first. Okay, so we have had several listeners who are asking if you can elaborate on the additions to the new edition. You know, what's new in the new edition of Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children?
Hi, this is Glen again. Yes. Well, first of all, there's 2 new chapters that we don't have in the 1st edition. One chapter is what we call emergency procedures or interim procedures, and that is directed at the circumstances in which a classroom has a child who's really melting down. And PTR-YC, to develop the interventions, takes a little while, a few meetings, as Janice described, maybe a couple weeks or so. So what do you do in the interim? So we have a chapter that is devoted to that. We also have another chapter just on getting ready and getting the classroom in shape, or in optimal shape to use PTR-YC. Other than that, there are updates and, you know, a few tinkering and improvements of some forms. Most of the forms have small improvements with them, but generally there isn't a whole lot more other than that.
Okay, great. Yeah, those 2 new chapters they're exciting additions to the book. Let's see. We had a few listeners who were asking if the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for Young Children model can be used in a non-group setting. For example, can it be used in a home?
That's a good question. And the answer is, I'm going to give you a 2-fold response. One is that the framework prevent, teach, reinforce, and the 5 steps are pretty much universal. We use them for K through 12, we use them for early childhood settings, and we use them at home. Basically, it's not different from individualized positive behavior support. So it can be applied essentially anywhere. The difference with PTR-YC and the other PTR models is the specificity of the process and the details that go into it. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part is that we have a model of PTR called PTR-F, or PTR for families, that is explicitly intended for use in home and community settings. And frankly, the majority of the time it's in home settings, to be implemented by parents with some support. So I guess that's my answer.
Great. Let's see. I know we also had several listeners who are asking if there are any sort of prerequisite learning, education, certification requirements to use the PTR-YC or PTR-F models.
There's nothing formal in that respect, but we strongly recommend that the team include at least one member who is familiar with the basic principles that I laid out near the beginning of this session, or which also translate to behavior analytic or principles from applied behavior analysis. If people really understand the importance of function and of functional behavioral assessment, and then also if somebody, at least one person, has some experience with individualized positive behavior support, those are basically the prerequisites. But we've had lots and lots of people use this model, and for the most part, we are seeing pretty good fidelity and as a result, pretty good effectiveness.
Yeah, I guess kind of building on that too, we had a couple listeners that were saying that fidelity of implementation can be tough in a center-based setting. So do you have any strategies that you found to be effective in promoting consistency and high fidelity across professionals within a center-based setting?
Yeah, and I think there has to be a consistent team, a real commitment to share and to work together and to follow the model. To a very large extent, it boils down to being committed to the well-being of this particular child. And saying, we're going to get this done. We're just going to get it done. I have to admit that sometimes in certain classrooms, there may be a particular member, I'm not going to specify who it might be or anything, who actually doesn't want to see it work. And the reason being is that this child may be so much trouble that it's just wrecking everything for the classroom. And sometimes what we see is somebody consciously or sometimes inadvertently like sabotaging the process. And that's something to watch out for. I mean, I only mention it because it happens, and because there are people who are just so sick of having this particular child in the classroom. That's a danger. That's a real danger. And the team needs to work against that kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to have everybody on board and working towards the same goal.
Precisely.
Yeah. I guess continuing on the thread of professionals working together, do you have any recommendations for who should be the lead in implementing this process?
Okay. This is Janice. I guess we always recommend the person who's the most familiar with the individualized positive behavior support process. So hopefully if you're using the PTR-YC model, it's somebody who understands the principles, as Glenn mentioned, and also is familiar with the model, as well as familiar with the intervention strategies and how to teach those individualized strategies so that they can provide guidance and coaching in that arena. So in some instances, it might be the early childhood mental health consultant. It might be somebody who's identified as a behavior specialist for that program or that school or that center, however that may look. In some classrooms or in some programs, it might be a BCBA, who might be facilitating this process. And I think I can share, in our research study that we conducted, some of our teachers participated multiple times, and some of our teachers were able to then facilitate that process, with the guidance and with some essentially coaching and technical assistance that was readily available to them. So, I think that is a question we get a lot in terms of qualifications and is there a certification? So our answer is yes and no, because again, I think another option that we see sometimes, especially in our school district teams, it might be the school psychologist. So we've had pretty variable individuals participate as the facilitator or kind of in that lead role.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of a non-answer to the question. I know it's not specific enough, but.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it makes sense. Let's see. We have a few listeners also.
Actually, the answer is Barbara. Barbara should be the lead. That was a joke, everybody.
We have a few listeners who are asking, how long do you recommend using one specific strategy to support positive behavior before trying another? So if one strategy, it doesn't seem to be working, how long would you continue to try that before you moved on to the next?
Okay, I'll try to field this question. That is a question that we get a lot, and I would say this is where the team's understanding and expertise with that child and with their own particular classroom is really, really important. So if we're talking about a child who attends a full-time 5-day-a-week program, a full-time childcare, for example, and there's multiple opportunities to practice these skills, perhaps we may want to consider that at least a full week of implementation. Some of our teams, we say, can you and are you willing to commit to trying this for 2 full weeks to see what's happening? For other children who may be in a half-time situation, or maybe they only attend half a day, a couple days a week, there's not enough learning opportunities necessarily for that child compared to somebody who attends full-time. So we may think about, over 3 or 4 weeks, for example. And that's what I was, briefly covered earlier, is that if we had a formula or an algorithm we could use, we would definitely be sharing that. And so that's what's the difficult piece of individualized support, is that's very idiosyncratic. And so again, the teams should decide what that decision process is going to be. And so we always recommend that they talk about that from the beginning. So normally when I facilitated teams, I say, is this something that everybody is willing and committed to try out for at least a couple of weeks? And if we can get that, then usually we get really good traction with that. But again, I think that really is a team decision that needs to be made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions. We have a couple listeners that are asking, due to the current pandemic, a lot of EC programs are already short-staffed and stressed. So in general, do you have a guideline for how much time teachers should plan to have dedicated to teamwork?
Yeah, that's we're getting that question quite a lot in terms of the time. There's a lot of extra things on people's plates these days. There's added elevated stress, there's elevated restrictions, and so it does cause a lot of issues and concerns. There's early childhood programs that are virtual or some hybrid model, some are still fully in person, with limitations and restrictions. So I think the time component, again, if it's really the commitment is what it comes down to. So if it's a priority for the classroom team and for that program, then people will find the time. That's been my personal experience working with multiple teams. And I wish I had a better answer, but again, it really comes down to that commitment component, that if people are willing and have that mindset of really supporting this child and the family and the classroom teams as well,
then you can make it happen. But if there is, even one individual on the team who may not be really on board, it makes it really, really difficult for everybody. And that's when we tend to see issues with either trying to move the child around to different classrooms or when we see, suspension and expulsion practices happen. Again, I don't think anybody necessarily wants to be doing, but it is what we're starting to see much more so now.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I know we've had a handful of listeners who are also asking if you have any sort of more in-depth training or, I guess a formal training for the PTR-YC, PTRF models.
Well, there is training available, and probably the best place to obtain it is through something called the Pyramid Model Consortium. The Pyramid Model Consortium has a number of people available to deliver training on PTR-YC and PTRF. Those people include Janice, other members of the core team that have used PTR-YC in multiple circumstances in many states and have implemented training quite a lot. So that's probably the best way to get it. I think if you Google the Pyramid Model Consortium, you'll come up with where to find contact information to request that kind of training.
Mm-hmm. Just to the audience, I did send out the link to the Pyramid Model Consortium website, so you can access that there. Okay, so I think that is all the time we'll have for questions. So thank you for everyone submitting questions. I apologize that we can't answer all of them, but we are restricted by time. And there are a lot of people in this webinar today. We're over 600 people, so it would be tough to answer all of those questions. So just a few more things to cover before we wrap up here. If you would like to obtain a certificate of attendance for this webinar, you can either access your certificate in the handouts section of the webinar and you can download it directly there, or you can go to bpub.fyi/PTR-YC-cert. Or you will also receive a follow-up email tomorrow that'll have a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as links to, I'll include the Pyramid Model Consortium website and a link to obtain your certificate in that email as well. And then just a quick, we are offering 20% off of most Brookes products at brookspublishing.com. So if you use the code COFFEE121, you can get 20% off of most of the products on our website, including Glen and Janice's books. And then if you're interested in additional professional development opportunities, we are today kicking off our spring 2021 Coffee Chat series. So we'll have plenty more coffee chats coming up, but we also have over 30 coffee chats recorded that you can go on to our website and watch the recordings of. So if you go to bpub.fyi/coffee chats, you can access all of our recordings there and see all of our upcoming sessions as well. And I'll include a link. I'll include these links in the follow-up email as well, so you don't need to remember them or write them down quickly right now. We also have a handful of COVID-19 resources that we've put together to help all early childhood professionals. These include recommended readings, downloadable resources, and other professional development webinars. And so these are just to help you as we're all shifting our work habits, and so these are resources that can help. They're not specifically from Brookes. These are just resources that we've compiled to help all early childhood educators and professionals, and you can access those at bpub.fyi/COVID-EC. And so with that, we can wrap up. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to Glen and Janice again for presenting this terrific webinar. And thank you to everyone that joined us today for our first 2021 Coffee Chat. We're happy to kick it off, and we'll have plenty more to come. So thank you again, Glen and Janice, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.